And therefore what's happened is that the United States of America has had to highlight 6 ideological banners after the end of the Cold War. And these ideological banners are appropriate in different political contexts, in different geographical contexts, in different times. And there's even shifting from one to the other. Because you no longer have the advantage of simply having one kind of ideological banner in the way that you had it before. And what are these ideological banners? These ideological banners, I would suggest, are the 6 ones here. Number 1, the global war on terror. 2, humanitarian intervention. 3, regime change in the name of democracy, which is different, if you like, from humanitarian intervention, although strongly connected. Humanitarian intervention means humanitarian crisis, intervene, solve the crisis. Regime change means longer-term occupation, if you like, in that area. 4, weapons of mass destruction in the wrong hands. It's okay if the Americans have it, and it's okay if the British have it, it's even okay if the Indians have it, the Pakistanis, but not and the Israelis, of course, but not the Iraqis, and not the Iranians, and not the North Koreans, and so on. Weapons of mass destruction. 5th, failed states, particularly useful in parts of Africa and so on for informally even utilization of the UN and so on, and the war on drugs, which is particularly important in Upper Amazonia as well as in Afghanistan. And the important thing to recognize about these ideological banners, of course, is that they're not just concoctions of the United States of America. They are related to very real problems. And because they're related to very real problems, the American government and those who support them can actually utilize them with some degree of effectiveness for their larger purposes. But because they also relate to very real problems, we have felt in this book that there is a responsibility not just to kind of expose these selective, hypocritical and dishonest ways in which the United States of America has used these ideological banners or these discourses of the country, because the selective hypocritical is obvious. If you're talking about terrorism, which means international terrorism, which means the suffering and the danger of threat to innocent civilians, let's be very clear, the biggest problem is not Al-Qaeda or the terrorism of non-state actors. The biggest problem is the terrorism of state actors. Whether you're talking about the United States, whether you're talking about the Russians in Chechnya, whether you're talking about the Indians, whether you're talking about the Chinese in Xinjiang province or whatever, that's your biggest problem. And they get away with it. Who's one? And you're killing on a much larger scale innocent civilians through state terrorism. And this is something, of course, that people do see. The selectivity, hypocrisy of all that. Similarly, of course, with the weapons of mass destruction and so on. But because they do relate to real problems, we have felt a responsibility in this book to also address and to provide alternatives about how we can resolve that. And that has been the case, for example, in the war of drugs, in which there has been a very important suggestion. This is one area in which the Europeans have gone ahead of the Americans, and I'm not going to bind the American project. That is the harm reduction approach rather than the total criminalization approach that takes place there. So we have felt that this is the way that, and this book is basically about these 6 ideological banners, and it's also about the ideological preconditions for the construction of this particular kind of discourse. That is to say, the disease of American exceptionalism. Most Americans do not believe that the United States is an empire. They are not prepared to engage with the history of the United States of America and so on. And of course there is a fine chapter also by Susan George, which is about how the whole foundation in the last 25, 30 years for the spread of neoliberal thinking, right-wing thinking generally, took place, and how this has been very important also for stabilizing and promoting the subsequent ideological banners and discourses that I've described here. And lastly, I would say this, is that one of the things I think that we can conclude is that the United States of America, if it wants to establish its empire, has to successfully establish these, sell its ideological banners, and they do have a problem. If you look at these 6 ideological banners, 4 of them are negative. The strength of the defending the free world against the communist threat is that you must have, if you're going to win over people to your project, you must have a component which can inspire people, which has a positive vision, defending the free world. In the case of these 6 ideological banners, 4 of them are negative. The only one that has some chance despite its selectivity and hypocrisy of being in the very long term, it's not global war on terror, no matter how much it's being used, of course, is the one about spreading democracy. And this is where it leads, if you like, into the whole question of Iraq, because it's not surprising that in Iraq, the United States had to shift weapons of mass destruction in the wrong hands, Al-Qaeda, terrorism, now of course spreading democracy. And therefore there is a very special responsibility, and there is a conclusion here, which tries to point out the hypocrisies and the problems with this idea of exporting democracy, spreading democracy through force as part of your larger project here. And this, I think, is very important. Today, let me just end by saying that obviously, in my time, the center of world politics for a very long time was Vietnam. Today, the center of politics is the Middle East. And there's Palestine, there's Iran, and there's Iraq. And therefore, if we are going to be able to defeat and set back this entire project, what we are able to succeed in doing in terms of solidarity with the struggles in Iraq and in the Middle East generally is absolutely equal. Thank you.